In early 2014, a small town in Oregon was shaken when the local sheriff's department conducted a search on a sprawling 20-acre farm hidden deep within a forest. A local man had recently gone missing, and this farm was one of the last known places he had visited. During the search, a deputy patrolling the area outside the barn noticed something peculiar on the ground. Initially, it was unrecognizable, but as he got closer, the horrifying reality became clear. This discovery not only made national headlines, but also led investigators to uncover a far more sinister situation unfolding in that seemingly quiet town. By most standards, Susan Monica had led a fulfilling life. She had a close-knit group of friends, a successful career as an engineer, and she lived in the vibrant city of San Francisco, California. But despite these outward successes, Susan was unhappy. City life, with its constant noise and crowds, didn't suit her. She longed for solitude, peace, and the ability to live off the land, far away from the hustle and bustle. In 1991, at the age of 43, Susan decided to make her dream a reality. She purchased a 20-acre plot of land nestled in the forests of a small Oregon town called Weimar. But this wasn't just any farm. It was undeveloped wilderness. There was no house, no barn, no running water, no electricity, nothing. To Susan, however, it was perfect. The isolation was exactly what she craved, and the challenge of building her farm from scratch excited her. With her engineering background and her physical strength, Susan was more than capable of tackling the job. When she first arrived in Weimar and saw her land, she was filled with a sense of excitement. Even though there was nothing on the property yet, she felt like she was finally home. Over the next few months, Susan transformed the rugged terrain into a functional farm, complete with a barn, a small shack where she lived, and pens for livestock. However, once the farm was built, Susan quickly realized that maintaining it was far more challenging than she had anticipated. The daily chores, feeding the animals, tending to the land, and working on various projects were exhausting. Despite her desire for solitude, Susan recognized that she needed help. Reluctantly, she began posting help-wanted flyers around town. It didn't take long for people to start showing up at her farm, inquiring about the job. Most of the applicants were individuals who had difficulty finding work elsewhere, either because they led transient lifestyles or had criminal records. But Susan didn't care about their backgrounds. All she wanted was for them to work hard and respect the tranquility of her farm. Essentially, she wanted them to do their job and leave her alone. Over the next 2 decades, Susan hired dozens of workers. Some stayed for only a short time, while others stuck around longer, but eventually they all moved on. Once they left, Susan rarely, if ever, heard from them again. But that was about to change. On January 1st, 2014, Susan, now 66 years old, was standing outside her shack when she noticed a car driving up her long, secluded road. Living in such isolation, she almost never had visitors, so the sight of the car immediately grabbed her attention. The car pulled into a driveway, and out stepped 3 young people, 2 men and a woman. Before Susan could ask who they were, they explained that they were looking for their father, Robert Haney. He had mentioned working on Susan's farm in exchange for some cash and a place to park his camper. The siblings said their father always kept in touch with them at least every couple of months, but they hadn't heard from him in a long time. Without a cell phone or permanent address, they had no way to reach him, so they decided to come and check on him in person. When they asked Susan if she knew where their father was, she immediately recognized the name. She told them that she had hired Robert the previous spring to help build a structure on her farm. At first, Robert was an excellent worker, quiet, diligent, and accompanied by a friendly dog. However, in August of the previous year, about 5 months into his employment, Robert's behavior drastically changed. He began drinking heavily, neglecting his work, and spent much of his time ranting and raving outside his camper, talking about revenge. Susan later learned that Robert was tormented by guilt because one of his children had been assaulted, and he hadn't been there to protect them. He coped with his guilt by drinking and obsessing over getting revenge on the attacker. Although Susan understood Robert's pain, his erratic behaviour disrupted the peaceful atmosphere she valued so much on her farm. She knew she might have to confront him about it, or even let him go if he couldn't calm down. But before she had the chance, Robert approached her one day, handed her an envelope filled with cash, and asked if she could look after his dog for a while. Surprised by his sudden change in demeanour and unusual request, Susan agreed. She watched as Robert walked away, got into a white car that had pulled up at the property's edge, and drove off. She didn't recognise the car or know who was driving. That happened back in September, Susan explained, and she hadn't heard from Robert since. His dog was still in her care, and many of his belongings were still in his camper. Susan led the siblings to Robert's camper, and inside they found his things scattered about, just as he had left them. But what immediately caught their attention was their father's tool belt. Knowing that Robert was a travelling handyman, they couldn't understand why he would leave behind something so essential to his work, especially if he planned to be away for a long time. It didn't add up. After leaving Robert's camper, his children thanked Susan and asked her to please contact them if she learned anything more about their father. Susan assured them she would. The siblings then got back in their car and drove south to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. Upon arrival, they requested to file a missing person report for their dad. However, they quickly realised that finding their father would be challenging due to his transient lifestyle. No cell phone, no permanent address, and nothing traceable. Despite these difficulties, the investigators shared the children's concern, especially given Robert's last known behaviour of heavy drinking and talk of seeking revenge on someone who had harmed his child. The sheriff and his deputies feared Robert might have acted on those threats and was now in hiding. The investigators asked the siblings if there was anything that could help them track down their father. After some thought, one of them mentioned Robert's EBT card. EBT? Electronic Benefit Transfer. Cards function like debit cards for state welfare services, such as purchasing groceries, and they are traceable. A few days later, the trace on Robert's EBT card came back. Investigators discovered it had been used just a month earlier at a Walmart about 30 minutes southwest of Susan's farm. While this didn't pinpoint Robert's current location or condition, it was the only lead they had. The investigators decided to visit the Walmart to see what they could find. At Walmart, the investigators were taken to the back room, where they reviewed security footage from the day Robert's EBT card was used. After combing through hours of video, they never spotted Robert. Instead, to their shock, they saw Susan using Robert's EBT card. This discovery was highly suspicious. The investigators immediately left Walmart and returned to their office to begin the process of obtaining a search warrant for Susan's farm. A few days later, on January 10th, the sheriff and his deputies arrived at Susan's property. As they pulled into the driveway, Susan came out to greet them. When she asked what was going on, they informed her they were there to search her property in connection with Robert Haney's disappearance. Before Susan could ask any more questions, the sheriff said, "Hold on, let's go inside. I need to speak with you privately." Susan, clearly shocked, agreed and led the sheriff into her house while the other deputies spread out across the property to begin their search. Inside Susan's kitchen, the sheriff wasted no time. He said, "We have you on camera using Robert's EBT card. I know you stole it, so tell me where Robert is right now, or this is going to get a lot worse for you." At this, Susan's expression shifted from shock to a strange sense of relief, as if she finally understood what was happening. She replied, "I didn't steal his EBT card. He gave it to me, along with an envelope of cash, before he left 4 months ago. He told me to use it to buy food for his dog, which I've been looking after." Susan added that, since Robert had been gone for so long, she ran out of cash and started using the EBT card. She also pointed out that if she had stolen the card, she wouldn't have been able to use it because it required a PIN number, one that Robert had provided to her. The sheriff, not fully convinced by Susan's story, continued questioning her, trying to catch her in a lie. However, Susan remained firm, insisting that Robert had willingly given her the card. After several minutes, the sheriff began to suspect that Susan might be telling the truth, meaning the EBT card lead was likely a dead end. He prepared to leave the kitchen and call off the search when a deputy suddenly rushed in, leaned down, and whispered something in the sheriff's ear. As the sheriff listened, his face twisted in disbelief and disgust. When the deputy left, the sheriff turned back to Susan, took a deep breath and said, "Ma'am, you're going to have to come with us." Back at the station, Susan, now visibly flustered, was led into a small interrogation room. She sat down, looking around nervously, wondering what was happening. The sheriff entered the room, turned on the camera, and immediately asked, "Has anyone died on your property?" What Susan told the sheriff that day was so shocking and horrific that it made headlines across the country. Susan began by reiterating that everything she had said about Robert's disappearance was true. However, she admitted that she had left out one crucial detail. After Robert handed her the envelope of cash and the EBT card and drove away in that stranger's car, he eventually returned to the farm. Susan discovered his return one morning when she went outside to feed her animals. She noticed something unusual at the pig pen. The pigs, normally lounging around at that time of day, were all standing and had gathered in a circle, focused on something on the ground. Sensing something was wrong, Susan dropped her food and rushed to the fence. As she got closer, she realized the pigs weren't just looking at something, they were eating it. When she reached the center of the circle, she was horrified to find Robert lying on the ground, disemboweled and being devoured by the pigs. Even more shocking, Robert was still alive, weakly moving his arm and groaning in pain. Susan tried to pull the pigs off Robert, but they were in a feeding frenzy, aggressively continuing to eat him. She considered lifting him out of the pen, but he was so severely injured that she feared moving him would unalive him anyway. So, she did what she thought was the right thing at the time. She left the pen, retrieved a fire weapon from the barn, returned to the pigs, and shot Robert, ending his suffering. Susan claimed it was an act of mercy. After Robert died, she left the pen and returned 3 days later with bags to collect what little remained of his body. She tossed the bags of remains into the barn on top of a trash pile. But Robert's remains hadn't stayed in the barn, because what the deputy had whispered to the sheriff during their conversation in Susan's kitchen was, "Sir, we found a leg outside." The leg discovered by the deputy was indeed Robert's. It wasn't found in the barn's trash pile, but out in the open, in the middle of Susan's property. When confronted with this information, Susan speculated that a wild animal might have entered the barn, grabbed the leg, and dragged it outside. The sheriff, at a loss for what follow-up questions to ask, simply asked, "Why didn't you call 911 when you first saw Robert? Maybe we could have saved him, or at least, after he was dead, why didn't you tell anyone?" Susan explained that she didn't notify anyone because she feared that if word got out about what her pigs had done, they would be euthanized, which would destroy her primary source of income as she sold the pig's meat in town. She worried that even if her pigs weren't euthanized, people would refuse to buy meat from pigs known to have attacked and eaten a human. Susan eventually told the sheriff where they could find the bags containing what was left of Robert's remains, and she even offered to take a polygraph test to prove she was now telling the whole truth. But during the test, she kept fidgeting, coughing, and dramatically sighing, causing the test operator to get inaccurate readings. After the first polygraph, the results were inconclusive. The investigators had her take another test, but again, she continued to fidget and yawn. Finally, the investigators in the room decided to call off the test. They warned Susan, "We're going to search your farm, and if there's anything you haven't told us, you're going to be in serious trouble because we'll find it." At this point, Susan stopped fidgeting, looked up at the investigators, and after a long pause, she reached out, grabbed a piece of paper and a pen, and began drawing something. After a few moments, it became clear she was drawing a map of her farm. Once she was done, she marked a big X in the middle of the map, slid it across the table to the investigators and said, If you go to that X, you'll find Stephen. The investigators were puzzled. Who's Stephen? We're here about Robert, they said. It turned out that Robert wasn't the only farmhand who had met a grisly end on Susan's property. In 2012, a year before she hired Robert, Susan had employed another man named Stephen Delacino. According to Susan, Stephen was similar to Robert, quiet, hard-working, and easy to get along with. But at some point, she began to suspect that Stephen was stealing guns from her barn. When she confronted him, they got into a heated argument. Susan claimed she couldn't recall all the details, but at some point during the fight, a fire weapon went off, and Stephen fell to the ground in the pig pen with his head bleeding. Her pigs immediately swarmed and began devouring him. The investigators, stunned by this revelation, asked Susan why she didn't call 911 if Stephen's death had been an accident. Once again, Susan reiterated her fear that her pigs would be euthanized or that people would refuse to buy meat from pigs known to have eaten a human. Despite the outlandish nature of Susan's stories regarding Robert Haney and Stephen Delacino, there was no evidence to directly contradict her claims. When Susan went to trial for the murders of Robert and Stephen, the case ultimately hinged on whether the jury believed her version of events. They didn't, not at all. The jury concluded that Susan, known for having a quick temper, had intentionally shot both Stephen and Robert, then disposed of their bodies by feeding them to her pigs. It was only hoped that they were already dead before the pigs began to eat them. On April 21, 2015, more than a year after Robert's children reported him missing, Susan was convicted of 2 counts of unalive for the deaths of Robert and Stephen, as well as 2 counts of abusing a corpse. She was sentenced to a minimum of 50 years in prison. While in custody, Susan was overheard claiming that there were 17 other bodies buried on her property. However, despite extensive searches, no other remains were ever found. And that wraps up the horrifying tale of Susan Monica and the dark secrets hidden on her secluded farm. This case serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most unassuming places can harbour the darkest of deeds. If this story left you in shock, be sure to give it a thumbs up, share it with others, and hit that subscribe button for more deep dives into unsettling true crime stories. Stay safe, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next video.